Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. You know, by now we've all seen the videotape of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have seen as the unarmed Mr. Floyd is on the ground, incapacitated with his hands cuffed behind his back, while 4 officers hold him down, and one of those officers, Derek Chauvin, places his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck and keeps it there for 9 minutes, killing George Floyd, snuffing the life out of George Floyd, while the other 3 officers apply pressure to Mr. Floyd. We've seen the arrest of Derek Chauvin and a charge of 3rd-degree murder for what he did. We are awaiting the arrest of the other 3 officers who participated in the murder of George Floyd, who certainly assisted Derek Chauvin in ending the life of George Floyd. And we've now seen protests across the country. They've been largely peaceful protests, but there has also been a fair amount of looting, of property damage, of burning. Let's take a clear-eyed, focused view on how our government is responding to these protests, particularly our federal government. Now, there have been a number of news conferences given by the political leadership of the state of Minnesota where this murder occurred. And Governor Tim Walz has spoken with the media a number of times, as has the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner, John Harrington. And what is it that they are telling the public about the evidence that they are receiving and accumulating with respect to the protests that are going on in their state? Well, let's look at one of the quotes from the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner, John Harrington. Quote, "We have seen things like white supremacist organizations who have posted things on platforms about coming to Minnesota." Close quote. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that the only people involved in looting, in stealing, in burning, in property damage, in violence are white supremacist groups or alt-right groups or hate groups that are perhaps participating in these protests with a whole different agenda than protesting the murder of a black man by 4 white police officers.
As we've begun making arrests, we have begun analyzing the data of who we have arrested and begun actually doing what you would think is almost very similar to our COVID. It's contact tracing. Who are they associated with? What platforms are they advocating for? And we have seen things like white supremacist organizers who have posted things on platforms about coming to Minnesota.
So some of the evidence is showing that it's the hate groups, it's the white supremacist groups, it's the alt-right groups that are responsible for at least some of what's going on in these protests, some of the looting, some of the burning, some of the destruction. And what is the agenda of these hate groups? Well, we all know it's not to protest the unfair treatment of white police officers toward African American citizens. It's not to rail against an excessive force murder by white police officers of an unarmed African American citizen. It is to take advantage of the situation by traveling to the protest sites, looting, getting a little something for themselves, burning, destroying. And think about it, they get to not only destroy property, they get to destroy communities, they get to destroy the reputation and the public perception of the people who live in those communities, the people who are suffering and struggling. So I am not suggesting that all of the looting and burning and destruction is being done by hate groups, by alt-right groups, by white supremacist groups. Some of it is, but I am not suggesting all of it is. But when we have evidence that some of it is, we can't ignore that evidence. Or can we? Let's see what Attorney General Bill Barr is trying to sell to the American people about the nature of these protests.
Unfortunately, with the rioting that is occurring in many of our cities around the country, the voices of peaceful protest are being hijacked by violent radical elements. Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchic and left extremist groups, far left extremist groups, using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from outside the state to promote the violence. We must have law and order on our streets and in our communities, and it is the responsibility of the local and state leadership in the first instance to halt this violence. The Department of Justice, including the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, the ATF, the DEA, and our 93 United States U.S. Attorney's offices around the country are supporting these local efforts. We'll continue to support them and take all action necessary to enforce federal law. In that regard, it is a federal crime to cross state lines or to use interstate facilities to incite or participate in violent rioting, and we will enforce those laws. Thank you.
Wait, what? So Bill Barr is blaming it all on left-wing groups or extreme left-wing groups or Antifa-like groups, anti-fascist groups? So Bill Barr says nothing about the white supremacist groups, about the alt-right groups, or the extreme right-wing groups, or the hate groups. All Bill Barr does is rail against the left-wing groups. Hey, Bill Barr, your bias is showing. You might want to tuck that in a little. You know, what is Bill Barr really trying to convey? What motivates him? What animates him? What are his goals in all of this? You know, I think he may have told us exactly what makes him tick in a speech he gave back on December 7th, 2019, a few months back now. Let's have a look at what Bill Barr said.
Today, American people have to focus on something else, which is the sacrifice and the service that is given by our law enforcement officers. And they have to start showing more than they do, the respect and support that law enforcement deserves. And if communities don't give that support and respect, they may find themselves without the police protection they need.
And there it is. Bill Barr saying, you know, if certain communities don't pay the police the proper respect, well, then those communities might just lose police protection. You know, that's Bill Barr saying, nice community you got there. Be a shame if something happened to it. You know, for 30 years as a prosecutor, I worked with police officers and investigators and agents from more police agencies than I can count. And I'm talking FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Park Police, U.S. Capitol Police, U.S. Secret Service Uniform Division, the U.S. Marshal Service, the Metropolitan Police Department, the Postal Police, the Amtrak Police, the Metro Police, the Military Police. You know what I never heard a single solitary officer, investigator, or detective say? Oh, I'll protect the community, the citizens that I've sworn to protect, but only if they pay me the proper respect. And yet, that's Bill Barr's view of the world. You know, Bill Barr, your bias is showing, and your arrogance is showing, and your smug superiority is showing. And yes, your prejudice is showing. And your prejudice is showing with respect to both definitions of that word. One, you are prejudging. You showed us that when you tried to blame everything on the left and the alt-left and the radical left and the anti-fascist left. And you didn't say one word about the alt-right and the radical right and the white supremacist right and the hateful right. You gave them aid and comfort and cover and exoneration by your silence. So yes, you prejudged, and your prejudice is showing. Folks, as always, please stay safe. Please stay coronavirus free. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.